Let me begin with a question for Vinny. Vinny, you've been working a lot in this country and you've been part of the macro reforms from the perspective of the World Bank. How do you see the macro agenda translating into the micro agenda? Where do you see Ethiopia in terms of jobs, in terms of the future? What is your perspective, your vision of that? Thank you.
So Ali, I think that's a really good question, right? And it's something you and I have talked about a lot over the years. It's something we talk about. I can't find my team here. I don't know where they are, but we think about this a lot in the office as well. And when we're talking to other teams that are kind of struggling with this in the Africa region, where we're supporting big reforms, how do we kind of help translate that reform agenda into traction when it comes to the things that maybe people on the ground care about, right? And I think, from the experiences that I've had on reform, so before Ethiopia, I worked a lot on the Uzbekistan reform program. And for many years, that was a country that kind of moved away from a very, very closed, where you had like 100 police checks over a 1 kilometer stretch of road into a completely open economy that was liberalizing and bringing in private investment. And, I think there are some very common refrains. I think what Luis talked about a little bit, if we kind of aggregate that up into some important lessons for countries, I think the first and most important lesson for me that comes from that, and I think is very applicable to Ethiopia, is that reforms for reform's sake don't really ever work. If you just do the reforms because you need to do the reforms, or you're just doing the reforms because somebody told you to do the reforms, that usually fails. Countries that have attempted that, usually slip back. Things don't work because what happens is a number of things. First, reforms cause a lot of pain when you start, right? Any type of an adjustment. You will see people like Alameo Geda, who are very, very eminent thinkers, have spent a lot of time on Ethiopia thinking about these issues. Every day I'm getting yelled at on Twitter from him. And he's right about something, right? Which is, if you do these adjustments and then you just leave it at that, right? You do the macro reforms, you adjust the exchange rate, then all you have done is make things more expensive for people, and that's that. And the reforms actually have to translate into something on the ground for people, some outcomes, whether they are quick wins that sustain the popular movement for reform, right? So if people have some sense of where this is going, or they start to see some benefits accruing quickly that then say, okay, I'm willing to sacrifice today. So one of the hallmark features of East Asian reform is consumption was suppressed for the sake of investment. People were saving, and there was a lot of policies that really compelled people to save for the sake of tomorrow's consumption, right? But that came with a lot of pain. But there were tangible improvements on the ground, right? So if you look at, when you look at the examples of, say, China or Vietnam or Korea or Japan or even Singapore for that matter, and Singapore is a little bit different, right? Because I think income started going up in many of the other countries. In Singapore, it took a little bit longer. The sacrifice was a little bit harder, but living standards improved quickly. Housing was provided. Health and education improved very quickly. So people may not have seen their incomes go up, but there was some tangible benefit that came with the pain, that allowed people every day to wake up and say, okay, I can see that the government is articulating a very clear vision of where this is going, and we're moving a little bit closer each time towards it. So I think that's really important. But then, okay, so you have reforms, and then you have a vision of what that could mean. You can't achieve it without the micro, right? You can't actually achieve it without changing things on a day-to-day basis. You can change the customs laws, as the government is boldly doing today, but then is the customs officer on the ground going to change the way they behave when an importer comes in, right? And it has to filter down all the way. And some of these are behavioral, but a lot of these come down to basic micro reforms. And Ali, you touched upon this link between the macro and the micro. Fundamentally, what Ethiopia is trying to do here, if you listen to the words of the Prime Minister and you look at the homegrown reform agenda, there is a reorientation of the economy that's underway, right? And it's not just about public and private sector alone, right? It's a reorientation of an outward orientation versus an inward-oriented economy. It's an economy that wants to now trade with the world through WTO accession. 30 years, Ethiopia said that they wanted to be a part of the WTO. And for 30 years, they didn't really do much. And then in 1 year, in the last 6 months, they've done more than they did in those 30 years, right? So they want this. It's happening, right? This outward orientation of the economy. But it's also an orientation away from capital intensivity, right? One of the big things that happened with the exchange rate regime was that capital was artificially cheaper at the cost of 130 million people who could be in jobs, right? And so forcing and thinking about what it is that's going to encourage labor to play a more important role is critical towards the wins, the quick wins that you can generate for people. Those are where the jobs are going to be, right? So if you have policies that actually allow labor to play a more important role, that would be a win, right? A move away from the move away from government to private is not just about central planning and markets and all of the things that Alamejo, Professor Gedda may criticize us about rightly in some ways, but it's also about changing the culture away from central determination to experimentation, right? Why should banks be enforcing the role of letters of credit and enforcing the job of customs and taxation? Banks should be allowed to experiment and give letters of credit to those that really need the resources. And firms should be able to go and access finance and bid and compete for it in ways where the right ideas are benefiting from the right amounts of finance and the right resources, and also sometimes the right industrial policies, right? So, this kind of an orientation away from debt to savings, right? Banks need to do more of the jobs that banks should be doing in Ethiopia, to compete for finance, to go and aggregate those resources so that they turn into savings, so that Ethiopia needs to borrow less from abroad and more internally. And finally, an important point, I think, on the micro, most economies like Ethiopia that start from a very kind of state-controlled environment tend to frown on services. But services play an immense role. They are job-rich. They are the glue that makes investment come together. No investment happens without ancillary services happening, right? But in many countries like Ethiopia, and the Soviet Union examples are the best, for decades after the reform starts, services are still seen as a bad because they consume resources, they're import-intensive. But services are so important to actually turning the economy away from what it might have been into what it could be, right? So I think all of this involves a series of micro reforms, and they have to move together. You can't just do the macro without thinking about how you do these things in concert. One of the examples that I give best about the macro-micro reforms is Uzbekistan. On July the something in 2017, they overnight devalued their currency by 50%. So less than what Ethiopia did, but they did it. The third day after that, they completely overhauled their trading and licensing regimes. Completely. To the point where the minister responsible for trade, who was notorious in Uzbekistan as a person who was just always standing in the way of exports and imports, was at the railway station handing bouquets to the exporters saying, we're stopping all checks, just get the product out, export. No more barriers. Something like 300 business steps were reduced to 2, which is, can you show that you're not exporting something that's like uranium, which is heavily controlled and you probably shouldn't export it without a permit? If you're exporting horticulture and you're exporting fruits and vegetables, go for it. Here you are, here's a bouquet. And that happened overnight. And basically what has happened, I think for me, in recent years, that's probably the best example of a country that has really put a clear goal. They want to halve poverty in 5 years. They want incomes to go up. They want social protection to expand. And collectively, what has happened is this micro and the macro have moved so well that even today, 6 years into a very painful reform, the World Bank does independent monitoring of reform sentiment in Uzbekistan, and something like 90% of the population still believe that the country is headed in the right direction, which is a dream come true for anybody running any reforms, because normally you lose that kind of popular momentum really quickly. So let me stop there and just make that big point, which is reforms for reform's sake don't work. You need to have a clear outcome, and you cannot achieve that clear outcome, especially when it's people-oriented, if you don't have a macro-micro linkage that's actually basically attacking all of these constraints that's stopping your achievement of those goals. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for your very thorough answer. Let me now move to Dr. Hassan Hussain. You are the CEO of a very important entity, Entrepreneurship Development Institute. You have worked with Ministry of Labor and Statistics, Labor and Skills, sorry. I want to know from you, what is your perspective on the Ethiopia jobs situation? And what do you think is the roadmap ahead for Ethiopia?
Thank you very much. Yes, I am glad I'm part of this discussion because I think the jobs agenda is the most important public policy agenda for Ethiopia because of the huge young population. So when I look at the the labor market here, one of the things that one can see, even from the surface, is the fact that our public sector is very large. It used to be the largest employer for years, but it cannot take on more use. So there is little room for employment there. In fact, I would prefer if the public sector is much smaller, so chances are it will get smaller rather than larger. If you look at the private sector and see who is employing, the number of small, medium enterprises in the country is very low compared to our huge population, and most of them are concentrated in Addis Ababa. If you go to many of the regional capitals, you don't see an enterprise that can hire more than maybe 50 people. So I think it is very important for the country to focus on increasing the number of enterprises, making those enterprises create jobs, grow, and become more viable. And this has to do with building the skills component, making training and other capacity building programs available for those who are running businesses, SMEs, which we are doing massively. The second thing is access to finance is still a challenge, a huge challenge. It's opening up, but not opening up fast enough. The third, actually the biggest elephant in the room, is the regulatory environment. Yes, a lot of reforms are going on, which is very encouraging. So the long-term prospects is very, very promising, actually. But currently, our SMEs are always telling me how stretched they are from all the regulatory burden. The policies are there, the practice is totally different. So with the taxation regime, we just passed a national entrepreneurship policy, and in there we are talking about all the regulatory burdens our SMEs are facing. And somebody was saying, people can start businesses and close them in a matter of hours. And our response was, yes, the policy says that, and yes, the reform has put down. But if you go to a one-stop center, it may take you months and sometimes years to close a business. So the policy is here. It will take a long time for the policy to be translated into action. And this has to do with the attitude of the public sector. I think, corruption, all kinds of inefficiencies, not understanding what's being pushed from the top. These are challenges, but based on the sheer amount of focus given to entrepreneurship and enterprise development, I see a bright future as far as job opportunities are concerned. The other challenge is skills. The talent pool still needs much to be desired. Our universities are going through an overhaul, which I hope will lead to more graduates coming out of universities with solid skills that are desired by the market. We are also working very closely with the TVET system for it to be able to produce graduates with the requisite skills and attitudes. I think that's bearing fruit. There is a lot of, that sector, it existed for a long time, but it was off the radar for a very long time. And now it is at the very center of the job agenda, and that's one of the things that makes me very hopeful and bullish about the future of work in this country. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you very much. So I just wanted to know from you, you're the Deputy Director at FCDO. How do you see things in Ethiopia, the economy, and FCDO's perspective? Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. And it's lovely to be here with you all today and to see some familiar faces. And for those of you who I haven't met before, I'm Rachel. I am the Deputy Development Director at the British Embassy here, and I also oversee our climate and economic work at the Embassy. I guess the good news is we don't disagree with the diagnosis of the problem. I think we see where the economy is at the minute is that it's the product of a number of imbalances that have built up in the macroeconomy over a number of decades. And fundamentally, what's at the heart of that in terms of our diagnosis is a lack of exports. And what that's driven is a lack of inflow of foreign currency that then led to the situation that we saw in 2024. So the question we're grappling with is how do we work with the system here, with the government, to try and overcome some of those imbalances that have built up over many decades. That involves for us growing industries that have the potential to export, trying to attract more FDI into the Ethiopian economy, and building up the private sector over the long term so that it can be the engine of growth and job creation here. That has remained our diagnosis, I think, for a long time here. But as the FCDO, as many development partners, we're a bit of a kind of transition point at the minute in terms of thinking about how we grapple with those issues. So historically, for a number of decades, the way we approached it was very much through a jobs angle. And we said we're going to try and do big sectoral interventions that are going to create as many jobs as possible in the kind of short to medium term. And what that led us towards was big investments in sectors. For us, it was particularly manufacturing, particularly textiles and garments manufacturing, commercial, agriculture, and the industrial parks here. And we were chasing jobs numbers as our core KPI, basically. And that did deliver big jobs numbers in terms of the delta in jobs, particularly for women. But I think what it didn't do was deliver any of the change that we assess is needed at the kind of systemic level of the economy to transition towards an outward-facing, export-oriented and growing economy over the long term. Just a kind of side note, I guess at the minute as the UK, we are fundamentally globally thinking about how we should do development partnerships. A lot of this is about moving from being a donor in the traditional sense to being more of a partner with government. So listening far more to what government's own vision of where they want their future to be is. There are a couple of snappy phrases that we're using, like moving from a donor to an investor. So thinking about how we intervene to mobilize finance from wider sources, and thinking about how we do things like system strengthening rather than just stepping in and delivering services on behalf of a government. And these big shifts that we're thinking about are very appropriate in the Ethiopian context, I think, where you have a government with a strong vision who wants to own its future. And the role of us as development partners and the UK is to kind of step in behind that vision. A couple of things. In terms of how we're approaching the economic question, some people have already spoken this morning about sequencing. I think we agree with that approach. The first thing we think that's needed and that we want to partner on is stabilization of the macro environment. So a lot there. Then partnering to tackle some of the binding constraints that we see at an economy-wide level rather than a sector-specific level. So we have ongoing work with many of the ministries on reform of state-owned enterprises, reform of public investment management systems, capital markets, and trade and logistics as some of the real binding constraints we see to the economy across the board. And then the third thing we're doing a bit more of is trying to identify which are the firms that can be first movers and have real kind of demonstration effect, and then working with them to be able to attract investment with the intention that they then have a more systemic impact across particular sectors. And what I should say is we're not being fussy about sectors anymore. I think we used to be very prescriptive about which sectors we would get involved in as the UK. I think we see that the future of the Ethiopian economy is one where multiple sectors will drive growth going forward, and therefore we have to be nimble and flexible to the opportunities as we see them rather than prescriptive. So that's a bit about where we're going as the UK. I think in relation to this conversation, it means that we don't have jobs as a KPI in the British Embassy anymore across our economic work. What we're trying to think about is how we can work with partners such as Vinny, with the government, with lots of you represented here today about how you have systemic transformation at the economy-wide level, and that's much, much harder to put a price tag on and to have specific KPIs, but we think that's where we need to go for the future.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for your comprehensive answer. Now I go to Wengel Tasema. You are a program lead, deputy program lead at First Consult. You have a lot of experience on the ground in Ethiopia with enterprises and firms. Can you provide your perspective on how you see the growth jobs next to us and your practical experience of First Consult? Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll answer this question mainly from our program implementation experience that has focused a lot on supporting businesses to grow and drive job creation, so more in the private sector lens. So from that perspective and at a bigger picture level, our private sector, in the private sector landscape, we have around 2.2 million micro, small, and medium enterprises, as it has been said in this morning. Of course, these are the formal ones. But the most important point to note here is more than 90% of these enterprises are micro and small, which means we're getting an average of 2 to 3 jobs per enterprises. So that's not a lot on its own. That means we need the businesses to grow to drive the jobs that we all desperately need in this country. So what we've constantly seen is that we need several things to come together to support businesses to grow and drive jobs. It's not one thing in silo here and there that needs to be fixed, even starting from the macro reforms all the way down to the micro, the day-to-day experiences that the businesses have. So from that, I'd like to focus just on 3 main points, maybe. Dr. Hassan, you've already mentioned the big elephant in the room, but that was also the first one on my list, and that's the business climate and business environment. Businesses need their business environment to be super predictable for them to be able to thrive and invest on themselves and drive the jobs that they require. In the absence of it, of course, we notice that businesses will be super cautious, let alone on creating jobs, even to invest on themselves and then grow. So that's the big point that I would like to maintain. Maybe in the second round, I will give some examples on this. The second one is skills. There was already a discussion on it, but I'd like to still focus on it because that's another key important point that we keep running into. So on skills, I would like to focus on 2 sub-points. One is business skills. Our entrepreneurs, do they have the basic business literacy, business planning, customer handling, time management, problem-solving skills that they need? This is super important for them to be sustainable. You know, we do some program implementation, we go after 2 or 3 years, are we sure that we're going to see these businesses still in operation? Without these basic skills, that's not possible. And again, under skills, the skills of the labor force. It has been discussed. Dr. Teddy has mentioned it as well in his questions. what kind of labor force do we have currently? There's an obvious knowledge on this. There's a big mismatch between what the education system is producing and what the enterprises or the business environment is demanding. So it's a big mismatch. What we've also seen is that businesses don't also invest on their workers, right? Maybe Vinil, you'll add on this later, but I think it has to do with incentives as well. You know, businesses care more about or invest more on their assets rather than skills. And overall, we have a very low investment on skills across the board. So when we do have businesses that are in their expanding phase, they don't have the skilled labor force that they need in the market. So we always say, yes, there are people looking for jobs, but we always also say that from our perspective, there are a lot of businesses looking for the right people. So there is a huge mismatch there. The third point is finance. I think I don't need to say much on this. I think it's a very well-known concept, but just one point here is out of the total loanable fund that we have in our financial sector, 90% of it goes to 10% of our businesses, and that's mostly large and medium-sized businesses that offer collateral. So when you look at the micro and small businesses, they're basically not served. Yes, we do recognize there are different programs. We also have some programs that are supporting this side, but of course, it's not anywhere that we need it to be. Sometimes what we've seen is also like the transactional cost to actually acquire a loan successfully is much higher for medium and for micro and small enterprises, which means it just makes it not worth it for them to pursue borrowing from the financial institutions. To put all this in perspective, though, even when all these things do come together and businesses are growing, we notice a lag between business growing and them deciding to hire the next phase, the next cohort of their workers. It's not automatic. Jobs don't automatically follow. Businesses want to see that this growth that they're experiencing, that it is sustainable, and they're going to again pass through a good time for another 1 or 2 years. So I think I'll stop by saying that it's very, very important to note that there is going to be a lag whenever we're designing programs that support jobs. And when we set expectations, this lag is very important to note. Yeah, thank you, Ali.
Luis, two questions for you. What did Asia do in terms of industrial policy? Did it pick winners and then see, or did it wait for the clusters to emerge? Like, should countries like Ethiopia pick sectors? And two is, what's the sunset clause? Like, what if you give subsidy to industries and then they don't perform well? Do you keep on giving subsidies? Like, so what is the nuance in Asia? And the final point is on skills. Where did all these Vietnamese and Chinese workers get the skills? Did the government give them the skills? Did they learn on the job? Were they ready? So just wanted to hear your perspective before I do a second round here. And anything else you wanted to add. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you, Ali. Yeah, I'll be, industrial policy in Asia, it is not easy to generalize because, these are 5 or 6 or 7 economies that we look at. It's also, of course, over a long period of time, and these industrial policies evolved over time. I personally, I don't want to call myself an expert on Japan industrial policy. I understand better China and a little bit South Korea and Taiwan. I would say that generally speaking, they would offer conditional support in South Korea and Taiwan. Conditional support meaning that there was a high degree of cooperation and interaction, engagement between the bureaucrats and the companies. The bureaucrats were kind of breathing down the neck of the companies, seeing if they are able to compete, to raise their productivity, to improve their export packages. If not, these subsidies would be withdrawn. In China, I think that the industrial policy was less micro level. It is a little bit more, we're going to reduce, or we're going to keep the price of energy modest, and that will benefit all the industrial companies. Or we're going to, something that China did a lot in order to stimulate FDI in the first phases of its development was, we want foreign companies to build factories, so we're going to make it very cheap for them to get land. We're also going to make it very easy. Like, we will make sure that our local governments are very accommodative to the foreign companies. They will get land very cheap. We even are going to offer them a tax rate, a corporate tax rate that is lower than the tax rate that we charge on normal domestic companies. At the beginning of China's development, these kinds of policies took place. They have removed them as they felt we don't need to be so accommodative anymore, and it is unfair to other companies if we benefit the foreign companies too much. So things have evolved, but I think if I can make one general characterization about industrial policy in Asia, is that it is definitely not. It has not been open-ended subsidies that just go on and on and on, even if sectors or companies start to do really badly. So when things didn't work, when companies were not improving their productivity and their output, these subsidies were withdrawn. Then lastly, Ali, on the point of skills, I think that is an interesting one. There has been, I still remember 20 years ago in China, there were a lot of people, they were complaining. They said, look, our involvement in these global supply chains is so low level. Yes, there are iPhones produced here, but we only produce a very small part of the value added. We only assemble these things. So what is the point of all this? But then there were people, including myself, I remember how I agreed with the people who said, can we please not look down too much on the simple work that we're doing now? Because if we are able to start with assembling electronic components, then we can gradually move up the value chain. So there is a lot of learning by doing. 25 years in China, 25 years ago, there were not a lot of people with the kind of sophisticated manufacturing skills that were necessary to be a supplier for a multinational like Apple or Samsung, who set very high standards. But by exposing people to the standards of these companies and to working with those companies, gradually over time, a lot of people like managers, but also people who worked with the machinery, started to gain those skills. So I would say there was not a lot of structured, support from the government in terms of setting up training courses or so. A lot of this was learning by doing. Back to you.
One last question to all of you before we open it up to question and answers is, what do you think moving forward are the 2 or 3 most important things, especially on the micro level, let's not get into the macro, that countries like Ethiopia should do? Like, I know, Vinny, you've been thinking a lot about this in your work. And what's the next generation of reforms on the micro? Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. I think we have been thinking a lot about it. I think for me, there are a couple of buckets, right? I think the first is on the regulatory side, just making it easier, for people, for ideas, for businesses to get on with their daily struggle, right? And it's, making it easier. That entails, trusting people, trusting businesses a bit more, and I think the trust deficit is very large in Ethiopia, and that's a legacy that needs correction over time. Whether it's an import declaration, whether it's somebody who wants to become a barber and there's occupational licensing restrictions that's stopping them in the labor market. There are these kind of, partly trust issues and partly this kind of idea that the government may know better or may want to kind of guide those things in ways that maybe don't need to be there and cause friction. Things like the one-stop shop, to actually make them work like one-stop shops. One-stop shops today are still, they still cause there are many challenges that are still involved. Even if you have only one stop, you stay there a long time. And I think, things like that, there is a lot of room in Ethiopia, I think, to open up and allow people to get on with the way they want to go, right? So I think that's the first thing. I think the second area of focus, so the business climate work that others have touched upon, I think is super important, but not just business climate, it also has to be the labor market. Because a lot of growth and a lot of jobs and a lot of income opportunities come from people who just want to do the things that they want to do. I think there's a lot of focus on things like, empowerment and giving people money to open up Lifebuoy shops in their villages. But there's only so much Lifebuoy people can sell. Not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Some people want to be farmers. Some people want to be waged employees. So it's actually rethinking about what it is that labor market reform can do to support that, right? So occupational licensing, labor codes, maternity, equal pay for equal work. These are not just weird Marxist leftist ideas. They're actually at the heart of what could drive an inclusive and market-oriented reform process. I think alongside that is a big question mark about what the role of the state should be. Ethiopia is immensely lucky. I always think of Professor Gedda, who's my favorite kind of person to think about. How will I talk to him about this, right? Because he's got these preconceived notions. I actually think it's a really important thing to have a strong state, and Ethiopia is immensely lucky to have that. No successful country has really managed a transition without a strong state, including the US. How much has the Small Business Administration done in the US to actually support those micro reforms, right? There is a real strong role for government. But it looks different in an environment where you're actually letting people get on with what they want to do, right? So what is the role of government? How do you empower that culture? And that comes back to the question you asked Lewis as well. What is the role for industrial policy? It needs to be more experimentative, more courageous in taking away things when things don't go well. Today, a lot of businesses continue to enjoy incentives, primarily because they're so well connected, or they're just such legacy institutions that there's too much fear in withdrawing those and sunsetting those provisions, right? Where people are just not generating the kinds of returns that they may have promised when they committed to these investments in the first place. Take it away. That's what Korea did. That's what China did. That's what Vietnam did. And that promotes a culture, much more open culture of competition that allows good ideas to thrive, right? The final thing I would say here is letting go a little bit and allowing market formation to happen. I agree with Luis about one thing for Ethiopia that I think is maybe in disagreement with what emerging thinking is around the role of manufacturing. A lot of people consider manufacturing no longer to be a viable source of growth and development. I just don't agree. I don't agree. In Ethiopia, I'm really optimistic about it. It's got the people. It's got the factor endowments. The only thing I complain about is I'm watching too much Bitcoin being generated and not enough jobs being created from all of those endowments, right? And that's where we need to think about what the right model could be. And here, I think it's about allowing the market to discover and form in ways that it's not doing at the moment. And that comes back to basic things like access to finance, access to land, making it easier for ideas to be tested, and for the good ideas to be scaled, and for the bad ideas to fail fast. All of that requires these types of micro-level interventions, whether they are regulations, whether they are investments in human capital and skills, whether they are removals of restrictions in the labor market, and finally, most importantly, as two others have said here, who deal with these at a front line, whether it's about attitudes and behaviors. You have to want this to happen, and it has to come from the top, right? And changing that culture straight from the top all the way to the bottom is not an easy lift. It's something that requires a lot of time and a lot of thinking as well. So those would be my kind of key messages. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Rachel.
Thanks, Ali. And I'm going to sound like I've drunk the World Bank Kool-Aid on this. But I guess three things. I mean, as we speak to our businesses who are interested in coming to Ethiopia to invest, set up operations and so forth. I mean, the main thing they ask for is stability and reliability. So to know with some degree of certainty what the environment will be like, what are the bills that they'll be subject to, how will they be treated, and for there to be stability in that context. So I think there's a piece around continuing the push on stabilisation and consistency in terms of business treatment here. Those businesses are absolutely up for kind of taking a punt, taking a risk. They see the huge opportunity here, but they need to know what their bottom line is going to be if they set up operations. The second thing is around competition and an environment where there is allow an ability for free and fair competition and for businesses to enter in that sense. And I think the key thing that we are engaging with the government on is not necessarily the kind of laws and the legal conditions on that competition, but the spirit of competition. It's a lot of kind of what Vinny just said about the role of the state in the economy and how everyone within that system operates. There is obviously good intention in that space, but I think it's a challenging and ambitious journey to go on for the government. And then the third thing I would say is access to finance. And we see that at all levels. We see that at kind of an economy-wide level, and you know the ability for the big state-owned enterprises to access capital at the right level, and the need to build up a capital market in order to ensure that finance is channeled to productive assets, but we also see it more at the micro level and the ability of businesses to access growth capital. So I think we need to open up that space a bit more so that these businesses can grow.
Thank you. Wenger, you have to use the word gender in one of your answers.
I'll try, but I'll start with the finance concept, the access to finance concept Rachel just touched upon. So on that, of course, it's a critical factor that we all will have to work on, but I just wanted to bring in one perspective on this in terms of like how we need to access private capital and public capital as well, because the development finance or the development funding that we see in the economy is much smaller, right? So in all our programming designs, we just have to make sure that we're blending finance and like multiplying what we're getting from our donors and development partners by getting into the public and the private capital, because otherwise the development challenge that we're trying to solve is huge and it's way more than the development funding that we have. So in terms of blending finance, it's really also about like aligning incentives and moving all stakeholders along that line. The second one would be demand-driven skills, because skills for me is still on top of the list. So I don't know, I look forward to a day where employers and educators are really coming together, because I feel like there are a lot of studies done. Also in our office, International Growth Center was just telling us that there are a lot of studies that are done. I was in the Human Capital Conference that the World Bank has organized months ago. There's tremendous data there and recommendation. It just has to be now implemented, and including employers, public sector, and educators to really come together and implement those recommendations. I think we really have to solve this skills puzzle for Ethiopia. The third one is the public sector, the predictability of things for large enterprises, foreign investors, small and medium as well. We need the predictability of the business environment that we have, and like how is their day-to-day business experience looking like in Ethiopia? Are they regretting being in business here, or are they looking forward to doing more for tomorrow? So these are my 3 points. Thank you.
All right. I will have 3 points. The first one is on startups. We have a growing startup ecosystem. It is still brutal. The support structures are fragmented, but still there is some impressive progress. There is a program which, by the way, was initially supported by UNDP and implemented by us and the Ministry of Labor and Skills. We were able to work with close to 12,000 young people with ideas. About 1,500 of them went through our intervention and were granted some money. And out of those, about 580 of them were able to start their own businesses and grow them. And when I looked at, the ministry did a survey about a month ago, and they were able to create 30,000 jobs. So that is almost 58 to 60 jobs per enterprise, which is very impressive. I think that's an area where we need to do a lot. There is a lot of potential there. The second thing is I think the reforms should continue. Last week there were 3 reform initiatives. The first one is on customs. There is also more incentives for investments. Neither was as generous as I would have liked, because I would have wanted startups and fast-growing SMEs to be exempted from the taxation, but still progress. I think the new national entrepreneurship policy is a big departure in terms of following a whole government approach, not just the Ministry of Labor and Skills and a few ministries, but involving the private sector, the social sector, and big corporations and the like. I think that is a major development. On that one, the one thing that I would like to add is, having great policies is one thing, but we need to see them, how they are implemented. For me, a policy is when I go to a government office, how am I going to be treated? That's where the rubber hits the road. That's where you need those policies. And in terms of changing the behavior and attitude of our public sector, I think we have a lot of work to do. So I hope that will be the next focus of the reform process. My self-view is, yes, mainstreaming entrepreneurship, I think, is still, it needs to be prioritized, because this is not something that you get from your parents. You don't learn them in school. And I think there is a lot of work in that area. For example, this year, we were able to reach about 1.4 million young rural women throughout the country. And at the end of the year, about 600,000 of them were able to start their businesses. Yes, they are micro, they may not survive. But given their new mindset, I think they will bounce back. Even if their first attempt did not bear fruit, they will go on and create something else. I'm hopeful in that area. So we still have to focus on creating more businesses and being able to provide different support packages so that the ones that are existing are able to grow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Luis, if Ethiopian government called you and said, can you tell us two things that Asia did that we should copy, what would you say?
So really, maybe just going back to some of the comments that I made earlier, I think that it's, as I said, it's not always easy to, just take a recipe from one country, what did they do over there, and let's implement that recipe over here. But I do think that focusing economic policy on the real economy rather than on the financial sector is one important lesson that I personally think Asia did well. Secondly, focusing on how can the government help with the very simple, very basic requirements that we need to get right as part of our development, meaning basic health, basic education, simple resource mobilization. What can the government do to help over there? And how can we motivate our government officials to actually have that in mind when they go to work every morning, rather than, as in some economies, other things, more political things. So yeah, maybe these are some very simple takeaways. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to open it to question and answers. Please, you can have a general comment, or you can ask a specific member of the panel. So let's take some questions. Okay, sorry. Number 1, number 2, number 3. Please introduce yourself. And
one is, we are talking about the job creation potentials of micro, small enterprises. And I was wondering the impact of the exchange rate adjustments on creating burdens on local currency components for startup and small enterprises. I hope I'll get some reflections. What should be the policy options to ease the local currency burden on micro and small enterprises? My second question is, we are talking about policy options to 2035. That means 9 years down the line. And on the other hand, we are talking about the old tried sectors as recommendations, like, for example, agro-processing, textile, and garments. I know manufacturing industry at its initial stage is foreign dependent, and its employment creation capability is modest. But on the other hand, the impact of manufacturing industry is its ability to create machinery and equipment to itself and the rest of the economy. So why not the UNDP policy option did not recommend that it would be important to at least jumpstart initiatives to start producing or to develop machine production, equipment production, and spare parts production locally, because otherwise, really talking about agro-processing, textiles year after year would simply be tantamount to really recycling old short-term ideas into a new bottle to be pursued for the coming 9 years. I hope I get some reflections on these two issues. Thank you.
I would like to pose a question we often discuss about cultural and social norms, including gender, as just a social problem, but researchers also confirm that it has an economic perspective. So I would like to pose this question, where in Ethiopia, where we have social and cultural norms that are deeply rooted in our country, which hinders women's participation in the active or in the women participation, in the economic participation, or at least pushes them to the informal sector. So how can job creation and growth strategy actually actively bridge this gap? Thank you so much.
My question is directed towards Vinny. You've raised an interesting point about linking macro reforms with micro reforms. And I was interested to know a little more on what set of micro reforms do you consider should be, prioritized? Is there a set of micro reforms that Ethiopia should consider as most important, or should we consider a more holistic and interconnected kind of intervention? That's one. And a second one, probably directed towards a team from the UNDP. We've been talking about the formalization, informal sector, the formalization of informal sector. What set of incentives should be there to encourage informal companies to formalize themselves? For that, to take the initiative for themselves to come out of informal activities to the formal economy. What pull factors should be considered in terms of the policy-making arena, in terms of making it easy for them to register and do a formal business? I think the process should largely be a demand-driven rather than what should we do to formalize them. I think we should create the right set of incentives and environment for them to consider formalizing their businesses and activities. And in light of what has recently been announced as a mass exodus of companies going out of business, I think a lot of them have not went out of business, they've just reverted back to informality. And in light of that new report from the Ministry of Labor and Skills, I presume, what are your remarks? Just needed to hear your reflections. Thanks.
Thanks. Let me take the exchange rate question first. I think it's often a misconception that the regime that you see today is vastly different from the regime that businesses had to experience before. It's just a lot more transparent, and so you see the challenges more clearly today than you did before. But the challenges are the same, which is firms and people are out there trying to find the resources that they need to do the things that they want to do. Whereas they were doing it quietly, through the parallel market in the past, and only a few select people had access to the foreign currency at the cheaper rate. Today, I think one of the benefits, of that reform is that more people are now seeing what the true price of inputs is. That has an impact, right? So it continues to have an impact for as long as, people continue to face challenges in obtaining dollars. So that's, you talk to firms, they say it's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still bad, right? And obviously over time, the exchange rate depreciates, it gets costlier. So if I understand your question, I think it's about what can we do to kind of arrest that? What can you do to stop the pain for these businesses that are facing higher costs, right? And, and this is maybe the only time. I'm a very flexible, ideologically flexible world banker. I don't come with preset agendas. I don't have fixated neo-colonial or Washington consensus views on 99% of things, which I actually think everything should be more homegrown for every country trying to chart. But this one thing, you have to let the market work. You have to let it work, because if it works and people are confident about the Forex market, things will get better. Today, when you go to the shop to buy something that's imported, you're not just paying for the dollar that it costs them to buy that. You're paying for tomorrow's dollar. You're paying for the day after's dollar. You're paying for the next dollar that they don't know they're going to find. You're paying for the risk premium. You're paying for the fact that they may be getting those dollars illegally and that the person selling them the dollars may go to jail. So that is an additional price that they charge on the rate. And that's why the premium in the black market is higher. And I think more and more what we're seeing also from the government is this attempt to bridge that gap. And I think that will be important. And I think as people become more confident, you will also see a general decline in the demand for Forex. Today's foreign exchange demand is really not just driven by today's needs, but the needs maybe even a year ahead. And that goes back to a lot of the micro reforms as well. People place orders 10 months before they need the stuff because they don't know if customs is going to stop them. They don't know if ESSL is going to give them the ship that they need to bring the stuff that they need. And in fact, these types of things, it filters down. So it's not just the Forex reforms, but it's deregulating all these other steps. When I go to the bank, why is the bank my customs agent? Why is the bank enforcing what customs should be enforcing? Let them just give me the LC for whatever price I'm putting on there right now. these need to filter down, right? So it's this allowing the market to work and then allowing people to get on with it, which gets me, for me, the natural bridge to the question that came up here on this micro. What are the three things that matter the most? If you had to prioritize, I would say let economic freedoms expand. Let people get on with the things that they need to do in the ways that they want to. Let businesses get on with the ways that they need to. Freedom to import, freedom to trade, freedom to get on with exports, right? Freedom to choose the bank that you want to surrender your forex to. If you want to have surrender requirements, that's okay, but don't choose where you have to put it 90 days before so that the bank knows that you're caught with them and then they can choose the price that they want to. Let there be competition there. So expanding economic freedoms requires a whole host of business reforms, regulatory reforms, labor market and restriction reforms there. All of these matter. Second, social empowerment, which is a very quick bridge to the question. I know others are probably better qualified to talk about this, but I'm an unabashed feminist. I think that's the most important thing that you can do in any reform, is to take the people that are least served with you. You take those people and magic happens. In Uzbekistan, the things that I am most proud of, we did $5 billion of budget support to Uzbekistan over like 5 years. But the best reforms were not the economic reforms, they were the social reforms. Removing restrictions on migration, ending internal labor permits, allowing people to move to cities the way they wanted to, and then allowing them to get public services in those cities. Gender-based violence laws, establishing police protection for women who needed to go to shelters, establishing shelters, made a huge difference because a lot of people who were beneficiaries of access to finance were also victims of or survivors of gender-based violence at home. Suddenly freeing from that, and allowing those kids to go to school in another city through the migration reforms transformed the nature of how women were starting to connect. Maternity leave was another huge reform that we did. And we actually attached this, so it was like the IMF and the World Bank are going to the government and actually tying these types of reforms, not just the economic reforms, to the budget support. So for us, a big conditionality that led to like 6 months of delay and the government didn't get the money for a few months ended up being maternity benefits, right? To just guarantee maternity benefits on equal terms between private and public sector. And that took 3 months and we didn't budge. So I think I completely agree with your point about social norms and cultural norms, but I also believe that you can change those quickly if there is willpower from the top. You don't have to wait for too long. Some things, like a foreigner, I blame the Portuguese from 400 years ago for what they did here, and so foreigners are not as trusted as they used to be, maybe before that. I blame them for it. However, some social norms can move quickly if you put your mind to it, and you also align policies and incentives to it. The third micro-prioritization would be the state. What is the role of the state? The state, if it wants to have SOEs, then those SOEs have to run on competitive terms. They should be equal competition. One company should not receive more benefits than a private company. And Ethio Telecom should do telecoms, maybe not charge EVs, and allowing EV investors to come and charge EVs instead. These are very important lessons that we've learned from transitions all across the world, that businesses, that there is a role for the state, but that should be on competitive terms. And the state itself should be using its resources to empower people and focus on those other priorities. And where it needs to, it is empowering and enabling that economy through the right choices or the right kind of experimentative policies. So I think those, for me, kind of are the way. Sorry, I've tried to go around to everybody through that.
Luis from Hong Kong, do you have any closing words for us? Any closing idea after everything you've heard?
No, I actually, I support the points made by the panelists, and I think I'll be humble at this point because there is much more expertise around the table. So I support those points. Thank you.
Listen, I want to close now. I don't want to get too much in the way of lunch. So listen, we had a very interesting panel. I wanted to thank all the panelists and for the rich insights. I'm just going to also summarize the conference thing. So I think what we heard here, and we've heard from many others, number one, Ethiopia has huge potential, and it's on a positive reform path. Number two, stability, investment climate. Let's get rules there predictable, and let's get things there. Number three, I hear from Vinny, I hear a bit from Rachel, is experimentation, trying to deregulate, trying to bring in freedom. Let things happen with the private sector. Don't control too much. Then I hear four is finance. Finance, it's a historical problem. Banks are not lending to SMEs, but I think there's a way to deal with it. And finally, I hear that let's find creative ways bring in macro, micro linkage. Let's not use recipe from another country, but let's borrow and experiment. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for all of you to be here. Thank you.